Defending democracy, the slogan of left-leaning world leaders in Spain meeting to counter the growing influence of the far right. Meanwhile, in Italy, right-wing figures aim to build momentum. So who will shape the global agenda? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. Two gatherings in two European cities with opposing political perspectives. In Barcelona, left-leaning world leaders discussed the threat the growing far right poses to democratic institutions. Their aim? To bring together progressive forces under a single banner to counter right-wing authoritarianism. While in Milan, far-right figures rallied against what they called the tragedy that has become Europe. They are calling for fewer regulations from Brussels but tighter controls on security. We will discuss with our guests how this polarisation will play out across the world. But first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
A global meeting of the left in Barcelona, billed as a pushback against the rise of the far right.
Democracy cannot be taken for granted. We are witnessing one attempt after another to challenge the rules of international law. Meanwhile, inequality is on the rise.
The Spanish Prime Minister, along with Brazilian President Lula da Silva and other left-leaning politicians, activists and academics, are calling for global unity to counter the network they say exists on the right. They say they want to ensure diplomacy prevails over force.
Combat hunger, protect the environment and restore the credibility of the United Nations, which has been eroded by the irresponsibility of its permanent members.
Lula alluded to US President Donald Trump, but other leaders were more direct, criticising what they say is his administration's disregard for international law, citing the war in Iran as a recent example. At the same time, in another part of Europe, members of the far right gathered. Supporters of the European parliamentary bloc, Patriots for Europe, marched through Milan. Italy's far-right Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini addressed the crowd.
In Europe, our alliance is the only true adversary for the Brussels bureaucrats who serve a few businessmen and warmongers. Here in this square is the only hope, and it is you who protect our workers, the future of our young people and our identity.
Also participating, Jordan Bardella of France's National Rally.
Our allies in Italy are in power. We will discuss all the issues facing European societies, immigration and the ever-increasing regulations imposed by the European Commission and the European Union.
The right wing made gains in European elections in 2024, and parties represented here will be hoping to do the same this year. That is, unless the left can stop them. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest now. Joining us from Madrid is Ruth Ferrero-Turrion, a professor of political science at Complutense University of Madrid. She specialises in EU governance and migration policy. In Brussels is Rebecca Christie, a senior fellow at Bruegel, a European think tank that specialises in economics. And Georgios Samaras is in London. He's an assistant professor in public policy at King's College London, specialising in far-right violence in Europe and democratic backsliding. Thanks so much for being with us here on Inside Story. We really do appreciate your time. Georgios, if I can start with you. We've seen Barcelona on one side, Milan on the other, clear opposite visions for the future of Europe. Are these gatherings a sign of genuine ideological momentum, or is it all just political theatre?
I will start by highlighting that these are indeed rival projects of political articulation, but we cannot flatten them into mirror images. Because on the one hand, the Barcelona camp is trying to unify democracy, and the Milan camp is trying to unify sovereignty, exclusion, and this cultural threat. So the one seeks to widen the democratic chain, and I don't think that there is something performative about that. The other one, though, is trying to narrow the political community and make punishment feel legitimate. So if we try to compare those two camps, I would describe that it's quite a lazy approach between two very different entities. The one is basically trying to legitimize these punitive measures. The other one creates a focus on democracy that the progressive movement desperately needs at this stage.
OK, Ruth, if we can bring you in. The left is branding this as a defence of democracy. That's what the conference was all about. But is that framing convenient in some ways? Because millions of voters, despite what Georgios was saying there, they are choosing the right. Is that not also part of democracy?
Yes, the thing here is that for the last years, it was the right bloc leading the whole proposals on democracies, and I believe that the progressives, they wanted to take back some of the proposals towards the societies, and so it's true that we cannot divide this in two blocks, because I think that one of the main one hand is the progressives, and then we have a very, very strong fight within the right bloc, within the center right and the extreme right, or the right that is represented by Meloni or Bardella. And there is where we have to pay attention to, because in some points those guys are just really going further to threat some of the extreme values that which the European Union and the democratic societies are being based, like things like the rule of law and human rights that are being under threat by some proposals coming from that bloc. So, yeah, I agree with my colleague that we just cannot simplify in these two blocks. There are a lot of things to see carefully in detail, and what we've seen in Barcelona over the last 2 days, it's basically try to rebuild some bloc that has been missing out of the discourse and the agenda.
OK, they're trying to rebuild that bloc, Rebecca. Both sides obviously claim to represent the will of the people. Which side is actually reading the public mood more accurately right now and utilising that narrative?
So I would start off by saying none of these movements are monoliths, and the center in Europe is also a very important part of what's going on. If we look at, for example, the elections in the Netherlands, we see a distinct move away from the far right toward the center. We also see in Hungary a push for change. The country is still probably collectively to the right of where many other European countries are, but also there's hope for working more collectively. Because of the far-right control of many branches of American government, we actually are seeing Europe recognize the need to work together and across national borders. And that is a force that reduces some of the racism that has been driving these far-right movements.
OK, I want to hear a little more from the Defence of Democracy conference. Many asked what the point of the gathering in Barcelona was and really what concrete actions could come out of it. Well, leaders there were determined the meeting would not just be all talk.
The progressive response cannot be only to oppose. We must offer something that is better.
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa will present a draft resolution to the UN for an international panel on inequality, while President Lula and Prime Minister Sanchez are working on proposals for a tax on the ultra-rich, and the Mexican president also outlined policy.
We propose allocating 10% of global spending on arms, which amounts to billions of dollars, to fund a global program that enables millions of people to reforest millions of hectares each year. Instead of sowing the seeds of war, let us sow the seeds of peace.
Georgios, I want to know if you think that any of this is actually going to make a difference to getting people to vote for the left. Any of these policies or ideas really going to mobilise voters? Because when people are wondering how to pay their bills in a cost of living crisis, do they really care about a panel at the UN or deforestation at all?
It depends. First of all, let's focus on the messengers. from what you've all seen by now, some of the people who participated in Madrid's conference are hardcore centrists like David Lammy from the UK. I don't think that the message is radical enough. It needs to push much, much harder because they do still represent aspects of the old liberal order that never really existed. So in a way, many of the politicians who are now appearing in Madrid are not really innocent in this story. The messaging is certainly right, but the messengers are wrong because some of these mainstream parties have repeatedly borrowed far-right themes of migration, like David Lammy's government in the UK. The Labour government has pushed those messages relentlessly. So when those parties adopt those far-right issues, they legitimize them. By a more radical agenda, I specifically mean that they have to push towards the opposite direction. Stop talking about migration, focus on the economy, focus on the environment, tax the rich, try to basically not create top-down issues in politics, because once politics and politicians start talking about certain talking points, they end up normalizing them, which results in what we're currently seeing unfolding in European politics. And ultimately, this is not going to be a clash of two equivalent extremes, because there is absolutely nothing extreme or radical happening right now in Madrid. To summarize, the message is clear about democratic protection. The messengers are definitely wrong. And the politics of exclusion, again, that liberals have pushed for too long have helped normalize instead of confronting this kind of rhetoric.
OK, Ruth, I guess following on from that point, the Spanish leader warned of an international reactionary wave fueling hate speech, sexism, war and division without explicitly naming the US President Donald Trump. He went on to say it doesn't matter how much they scream or how many lies they spread, the time for the reactionary ultra-right has come to an end. How does he actually turn that into action, though?
Well, we've seen it, and I'm totally again with my colleague that the position that was been taken in Barcelona over the last 2 days is not radical enough. The problem is that Europe has moved towards right all the time, and even social liberals are just like looking like revolutionaries. And at some point they probably will be the Che Guevara, and they are not at all like that. But the point is, I think it's something positive that this progressive alliance coming to an end and coming to a strategic alliance with the global South as well, not just the European progressive bloc, and putting on the table things that has to do with redistribution when we have this whole debate within the European Union of their regulation. So they are asking for more regulation of the big businesses, for instance, or increasing public investment. And there is a whole ideological fight behind that. And if the progressive bloc is not ready to do this fight for these positions, this is something that the Social Democrats had abandoned for years. The third way was terrible for the social democracy. Then the end of the European Union will be something different. So I would say that this is in a way a performative action, but at the same time it tries to start. It is a starting point also to try to rearm the whole ideological bloc in the progressist area.
OK, Rebecca, obviously Ruth there talking about the third way moving towards the centre, and it does feel, has the centre been squeezed from both directions, and how does one side or the other actually try and re-engage with them properly here?
I want to push back against this idea that there are only two sides and that these sides are somehow some sort of cohesive agenda proposal that one can split into two groups. There are a lot of different democratic movements with a lot of different concerns. Likewise, when we use terms like radical change, we don't necessarily mean very extreme things like closing all borders or raising the voting age to 45. We sometimes mean radical shifts like overhauling the tax code or changing the way we do financial supervision. So it's important when we're talking about democracy to be specific in our terms and to acknowledge who we're talking about. I would again say that we see centrist voters perhaps changing their minds, as people do, about who they think can most help them and their standards of living. And we also see that the EU wants to come together in the face of a changing global environment and is looking for ways that they can do that, that allow them to preserve what they see as valuable about their national traditions.
Georgios, we saw that the cheerleader for the right, Viktor Orban in Hungary, is now gone. How significant is that, and what lessons can be learnt from that election?
It is a setback for the European far right, absolutely, but it does not really mark any real discontinuation of the broader project. Patriots for Europe remains the third largest group in the European Parliament. Orban helped build this into a more structured transnational force. Milan is basically a message to solidify this kind of power. But at the same time, people who believe that Tisa and Peter Magyar are going to somehow abolish authoritarianism are so wrong, because Peter Magyar is a former Fidesz member who was president of the party for nearly 22 years. I don't see discontinuation of authoritarianism in a country that suffered from authoritarianism for nearly 16 years. And the assumption that somehow democratization, a term that I despise, can happen just because a new government has come to power, is flawed. Hungary will have to deal with structural issues and introduce radical changes to the system in order to introduce liberal democratic changes, because the inheritance of political weapons that Viktor Orban is leaving behind is significant. So in my view, long story short, I don't think that Orban losing the election means anything for now. It might in a few years, but for now, it's just business as usual in Hungary.
Okay, Ruth, you touched on this a little earlier. Migration obviously keeps coming up as one of the defining fault lines. The left frames it as a humanitarian issue, but does that get enough cut through? And why do you think that the left hasn't really been able to take control of the narrative on such a vital, important issue?
Well, the thing with migration is that is the far right which are taking the lead on the narrative with migration. They're closing borders, not taking into consideration human rights. Every time we're talking about human rights, we are considered like a radical extremist and a revolutionary something. And we should defend these human rights, because the way in which the migration policy had been implemented, it will define also the nature of the European Union as a definitive pillar for that. So basically, what we have to approach here is to again, the Social Democrats or the progressives area. Of course, the liberals are included in that. I don't want to miss that point. But they should take the lead on trying to build up more human migration policies within the European Union. Right. The Pact of Asylum and Migration is not definitely a question of public policy, but just border control. And this is something that now the majorities are not allowing to change it, but it's going to define the future nature of the European Union, the way in which it had been implemented in the future.
Obviously, Donald Trump is central to the right. The left obviously criticising him for many things, including the war in Iran and disregard for international law, as well as some of America's migration policies. Is linking, Rebecca, the European far right to Donald Trump an effective strategy, do you think?
It depends on who's doing the linking and why. We saw that Vice President J.D. Vance of the United States campaigned for Viktor Orban in Hungary, and it did not make a difference in the Hungarian people's desire for change. I would disagree that the election in Hungary is not a big change, in that it opens the door for much more constructive work between Hungary and the European Union. And that in turn will help unlock all sorts of economic measures, support for Ukraine, democratic resistance against propaganda from outside actors. There are a lot of good things that can come if Hungary stops being an automatic veto for some of these things like that. Regarding the United States, the U.S. policy is extraordinarily unpredictable right now, whether it comes to trade policy, military policy, security policy. And the EU countries individually and collectively have to be ready to react to what comes at them.
Okay, Georgios, you touched on this, I think, in your very, very first answer. What is the media's role in all of this and how they define this issue, portraying divisions in society? Does that just widen them even further or oversimplify them?
Absolutely. We are seeing not just simplification, but a deliberate effort to create division. The uncontrolled power that certain media across Europe, especially in the UK, have managed to assume is troubling. And I'm not going to say that all of the issues that are being discussed currently, from migration to the economy, receive the equal time, not at all. But when the messaging travels from the top, hence why I refer to it as a top-down issue, from politics to the media have responsibility. And that responsibility is crucial because they can actually control how moral panic spreads. So media does not just, simply report about this and the struggle and constructs, the political frontier itself by deciding which grievances are linked together, which actors are treated as legitimate, and which ideas are repeated until they start to feel ordinary. So the contribution to the far right has been really important because it amplifies and repeats core signifiers. It tries to connect national actors into a wider transnational bloc, and also it weakens all their gatekeepers. I think in many ways the fact that this is also amplified on social media like the far-right platform X, which has boosted all of those political movements, is significant. So we're not just facing the media, we're also facing a social media environment which is so fragmented and so dangerous to democracy, to the point where more action is needed as soon as possible to preserve democracy and not just let it, in the hands of oligarchs and malicious, malignant actors.
And obviously the algorithms in those social media companies play into all of that as well. Ruth, I want to start rounding out this conversation as we bring it to a close. Who is currently better placed to try and shape the agenda over the next 5 or so years? The left or the right, without oversimplifying it, like Georgios was saying?
I would say that now the right is taking the lead. But as I mentioned in my first intervention, I think we have to pay attention what's going on within the right thing, meaning the center right and the extreme right. And we are having some examples all over Europe where the political agenda of the extreme right has been by the center right, and they implemented that agenda in issues concerning, for instance, human policies or gender policies or even migration policies. They are that taking those and to an extreme. We have observe how the Trumpist right wing has been losing the battle within that bloc, but we have to pay attention to what's going on the Popular Party, European political party, Popular Party, in the next years. As my colleagues had mentioned, Magyar Peter, it's not a progressist leader; it's a conservative nationalist leader, and we have to see if he's more with the Popular Party or with the people surrounding Meloni, which I think it's also very close to.
Okay, Rebecca, there's obviously upcoming elections in France, Italy, Spain, Poland. France's Marine Le Pen has said that they would give potential far-right winners the means to radically change the course of the European Union from within. How realistic is that?
We see in France that polls are generally split 50-50, so it's really not clear what will happen, and if it does happen, what that will mean for the European project. When right-wing parties come to power, many of them move toward the center. Some of them do not. And we also see voters have a number of ways to push back. I mean, Poland is a place that has swung back and forth from pro-European to anti-European governments and back. In France, we can also expect to see a moderating influence from financial markets. France is very fiscally overextended. It needs to keep its credit rating from dropping any further. It needs to maintain access to markets. And any French government will need to be careful of saying things that destabilize its continuous access to financing.
Okay, Georgios, if we can finish with you. How resilient is EU democracy at this point in time? Are we at risk of underestimating just how serious things are right now?
Things are quite serious, and I feel that it's not being discussed in the media. The fact that a democratic project that once promised open borders, that promised equality and a focus on integration and, I guess, freedom of movement is collapsing. This is primarily the reason why democracy across so many European states like Hungary, Poland, Greece, and Italy is in danger. So from extreme austerity back in the late 2000s all the way to this point in history where we have to make changes to the political system, the European project must change itself and not just redesign itself and create a more equal system of countries, but get rid of the far right. Get rid of the far right, not necessarily through legal measures, but by stopping this kind of rhetoric that has entered, if I would say, infected the centrism across all those states. And look to the left. There is no other way forward. There is no other way to get rid of this kind of poison that has been shaping politics over the past 15 years.
Thank you so much. We really do appreciate your time. Ruth Ferrero-Turrion, Rebecca Christie and Georgios Samaras. Thanks for joining us here on Inside Story. Well, thanks too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.